Thank you.
Thank you all so much for having me.
Thanks for your time.
What is the history of the neighborhood church of the brethren? Who can be better person to answer this but Judd Peter, who is the pioneer of this congregation, one of the pioneer. So Judd, tell us, what is the history of the neighborhood church of the brethren and how the traditions of the brethren has blessed your own family and the family of the church?
Okay, I'll try to be brief. The church was started in the 50s, which is a long time ago, and for most of you. But in 1960, my wife and I and our couple of kids moved to this area and looking for a place to live, found Boulder Hill. So when we came in, we were not necessarily even seeking a church. The pastor, Ken Yinks, stopped by once, and twice, and three times. And finally, after the fourth visit, we went to church, which was being held in a little house just very, very near us. We didn't stop to think about the Church of the Brethren being Anabaptist or a Peace Church or anything like that. I've been a Lutheran all my life, and in fact, this was my first job since coming out of the Navy after serving almost 6 years as an officer in the Navy. The theology wasn't a big thing in my mind at the time. And lo and behold, I find that that was true also of Ken Yinks. He was trying very hard for this to be a church that would serve everybody from a Christian background, no matter what the denomination was. And our children were growing up. And one night at dinner, my oldest son, I think he was a senior in high school, he said, "I'm going to Canada next summer." "Oh, what do you mean you're going to Canada?" He says, "Draft board says I'm going to get drafted and I'm not going to go kill people." Wow. Here I am, 2 more days. I've got a meeting for my regular monthly meeting with the Navy Reserve, and here's my son telling me that military service, it's not for him. Well, make a long story short, we worked through those kinds of things, and he didn't have to move away. He never did get drafted. But meanwhile, I resigned my commission in the Navy, which was a very expensive decision in the long run. And we sort of happily absorbed the teachings of the Church of the Brethren with regard to peace, for example, that came in such a deep and personal way, it was hard to ignore. And so ever since then, the church has been that integral to our lives. It's been that much as determining, how we think and what we act and what we do. Our kids all participated in NYC. His youngest son became a pastor and has been a pastor now for over 30 years. And I'm not sure if it would have happened if the Church of the Brethren hadn't taken the approach they did in Boulder Hill. And that was to set out to be the church for the community.
Thank you, Jared. Thank you so much for all this sharing the history and how it has blessed not only your own personal life, but the life of the church and the community around the neighborhood church of brethren. And I pray God may always use this church for his glory. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now we'd like to welcome Jonathan Shively. Jonathan, the floor is yours. Or the screen.
As soon as Ryan lets me, I'll get to the screen. I'm looking for some feature that will allow me to share my screen. Yeah. In the meantime, good evening. It's good to be with you all, and it's good to hear from Enton. Sorry, I can't, none of us will ever be able to compete with Purvey last evening, and but I'll drive the bus if we all want to go down there for some good food. I'm all in favor of that. So I think it was Rick Rick in his early remarks here that said, "Oh, everybody knows Jonathan." I don't want to presume that. My name is Jonathan Shively. I'm a member at Highland Avenue Church of the Brethren. I'm currently a member of the leadership team. My background includes time as a pastor, time working through the Brethren Academy and Bethany Seminary, time on the denominational staff, and a position at Pinecrest Community as a development director for a few years, most recently. And just exactly 18 days ago, I started a new calling, which is as executive director for the Fox Valley Hands of Hope, which is a organization, a not-for-profit organization that provides compassionate care for those who are experiencing loss and grief. And we are located in Geneva, Illinois, which is a little closer to my home than Mount Morris, Illinois. And it's a great organization and a good opportunity for me. So it's kind of what I'm up to. On the side, I have a little company that I started about 4 years ago that's called Artistry Leads. And last summer, as we were all still really settling into pandemic life together, part of the intent and purpose of Artistry Leads has been to support and help encourage and train leaders, and church leaders included among those leaders. And I was just kind of informally reaching out to many of my pastor friends at that time to just see how they were doing. And I was hearing lots of painful and somewhat terrifying stories. And so I thought, well, I wonder if anybody is really kind of asking pastors how they're doing and keeping track of that in any way. And not being an official church person anymore, a denominational person, I kind of wondered out loud if it would make sense for me to just ask some questions and try to get a sense of what was going on with pastors, both within our denomination and a little bit beyond our denomination. So I developed a survey that I distributed to pastors at that time, and this was in September. So a few months and half a year has passed since the data I'm going to share with you this evening was collected. But I think it still gives us some good insights into what's going on in the world of being a pastor these days. And hopefully nothing I say is or report to you is news to you. And if that's the case, good for you, because means you've been paying attention to your pastor and your congregation situation in a little deeper way. And hopefully you've been attending to it. But there might be some surprises in here, and that's all right as well. I'm going to share in the chat box a link where you can download this presentation. There's a lot of text in it, and if you want to have it in front of you, that's okay. I know I run the risk then of you running ahead of me, but that's all right too. So I'm going to go through some of the data, some of the things that I heard and learned from the survey. That'll take maybe half of our session. I'll try to keep that moving pretty quickly, and then I will. Then hopefully we can have some conversations about what it all means for us as a district, us as congregations, us as individuals who want to be supportive of our pastors. And there are a couple of pastors on here, so we'll be glad to hear from them as well. And I don't know whether or not the pastors on here completed the survey or not, but that's their story to tell, not mine, if they did. So we're going to plow ahead. I do have half an eye on a chat box, so if something comes up, you can just drop a message to me, or you can interrupt me. That's all right. I'm interruptible. So this is probably a familiar scene to many of us, as we have adapted to whatever our professional life is that has required us to stay home. But this little meme here, or representation, while not from our tradition, I think can resonate with a lot of our pastors and clergy people. As you can see, kind of all the things about home life surrounding this priest, who then is trying to represent kind of a more religious or spiritual kind of environment through the selfie cam. Enton did not address the selfie cam, but it's a real thing. So streaming through a selfie cam, carving out a sacred space at home in order to record the liturgy for Sunday. The survey that I conducted led to 110 respondents, and here's going to give you a couple different ways to look at who those respondents were. You can see here that just over half, almost 60%, were full-time, and this would actually feel like it's a little bit high for Church of the Brethren, and it is probably, but you'll see that not all respondents were from the Church of the Brethren. But also, a number of folks who are self-supporting, bivocational, and definitely part-time. And then as the congregation size grows and the ministry becomes, or the congregation becomes larger and more complex, we certainly have fewer of those congregations and fewer pastors in those situations. And then some others who just indicated other types of ministry that they're involved in. We had a few that were not specifically in pastoral ministry who still replied to the survey. Ask how long folks have been in ministry, and you can see here that we just had a couple, like I think one or two people that were in for less than a year, but really quite a nice distribution all the way up to 40 years of ministry, and a couple who were beyond 40 years of ministry in this final red piece of the pie here. But this is a really neat, I think, part of the survey, is that we have all this range of pastoral experience who's giving us their wisdom and their insight about life as a pastor during this pandemic season. Just try to find out a little bit about their educational background. And so you can see here, again, about 50% have a MDiv, which would be, kind of the standard educational track, but also then, at the top here, all these kind of alternate ways of getting education. Our own districts have training programs in many places, the TRIM program, the Education for Shared Ministry program, different kinds of probably bachelor's degrees and certificate programs toward the bottom half of this chart. And then 28% have a seminary education, but it was a seminary other than Bethany. So a couple folks with a DMin. So good educational pool here among the clergy. This should be no surprise, because most of our respondents were from my networks in the Church of the Brethren, and those tend to be pretty heavily weighted Caucasian. We were glad to have a few folks who identified ethnically differently than that, and we had one person here who was just being a smart aleck and said they're human. And here's the breakdown in terms of denominational ties from those that responded. So of the 110, 73% or 81 are Church of the Brethren ministers. So just keep that in mind as you're seeing this report. And then look, all these other kind of mainline denominations and You know, we got Southern Baptists on here too, couple PCUSAers, Christian Church Disciples of Christ, Methodist, Unitarian, Anglican, Evangelical Lutheran, Anglican Church of Canada, ELCA. Anyway, Presbyterian Church, USA Presbyterian Church. Yeah, so UCC. Anyway, some good perspectives. They broaden a little bit from our Church of the Brethren kind of center. This is an important chart, I think, to kind of pay attention to. How are our pastors getting support these days? Where do they turn, and what have they found reliable in terms of support that they're receiving? And so you can see spiritual direction is important to about a fifth of the respondents. Another fifth are in counseling or have a relationship with a counselor. The coaching process, mentoring process is real important to pastors. Some categorize their support as being a spiritual friend. But look at this, ministry colleagues. It's quite a community of ministry colleagues, and those you know, their ability to reach out to each other and their willingness and really reliance on one another. I think the most disturbing part of this graph for me was on the next one, which is the 12.7% or 14 folks who said they had no external or professional support for their ministry. And that's pretty concerning, I think, given the kind of burdens and responsibilities for pastors these days. So then we went on to kind of a scale of different kinds of responses. And on these charts, you're going to see here, the closer to 1 they are, the more negative kind of an impact the pastor views the context as having on their church and ministry. And the higher the number, the more positive influence that kind of cultural framework has on the ministry that they're a part of. So the first one was we asked, how is COVID-19 affecting your ministry? Now, remember, this is back in September, so things may have changed a little bit by now. But generally, if you look at this chart, you know, everything is mostly to the left of neutral. So to the left of neutral is it's viewed as having a negative or a challenging impact on ministry, and a pretty significant one. You know, you got 28% at the 3 and another, you know, not quite a fifth over here at the 2, and 8 pastors who said, you know, this is just really not well for us. And then a few folks who weren't experiencing it that way at all, who were having a much more positive kind of sense of being able to live in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis. The second one we asked about was national politics. And remember, this was pre-election, late summer, early fall. So, you know, a third said they were neutral, that they didn't feel that national politics was really having an effect on their ministry. Again, the larger portion felt that it was having a negative impact on ministry and on their leadership. And then a few felt like it was a positive influence. Social justice concerns, we were dealing with Black Lives Matter and a number of different incidents of Black people, innocent Black people being murdered or being treated, you know, harshly and unfairly. And so this also shows that there was an impact from that in our congregations, but in this case, the pastors seemed to go the other direction, that it was more of a positive kind of opportunity for their church and for their ministry to open some conversations and begin some work together that maybe they hadn't been paying attention to prior to that time. In some cases, I think to the left here on the graph, I think it proved divisive on a very hard topic for pastors and congregations. Environmental issues, there were fires raging in the West during this time. I know for sure that a couple of the pastors that said it's a real negative impact on their ministry were from the West and had been affected by some of those tragedies. Most said it was, majority were close to neutral on that. But as you can see, it can have an impact if it's a part of the pastor's reality and your community's reality. Economic conditions, how folks are faring with the economy, and again, a little bit more toward these are burdensome days or difficult days, which are ushered in by economic realities. So that's the kind of the hardest data in the survey, and we'll look forward to reflecting on those a little bit more with you if you'd like. I'm going to go on now to more parts of the survey, which were really narrative. From a statistical standpoint, I would not say that there's really much validity to this survey, but from a narrative kind of standpoint, there's a lot of rich material in it, and that's what I really wanted to focus on here. So these are actual words that I'm going to share with you that pastors used in their responses in the survey when they were asked, what they're experiencing right now, what their experience is like during the time of the survey in September. So the first thing, and we heard this in many cases, and it was great that Enton was with us tonight, but the pastoral experiences are different because there's a range of different worship experiences taking place from churches that have had no in-person, some even till today, but have used streaming, recording, Zoom, etc., to other churches that continued to meet in person pretty much the whole way through the pandemic, and some with fairly limited precautions. And again, not all these folks were from Illinois, so it kind of depended a little bit on where their ministry context was. But I think we tend to think that we've kind of been doing things the same, but we really haven't. We've had a lot of different approaches to how to continue to function during the pandemic in particular. Pastors report that they're increasingly aware of and seeing with congregants and community members the presence of mental illness, emotional distress, and addictive behaviors. Pastors identified the significance that the demographics that they minister and have upon the kind of responses that they're able to have to the pandemic and other concerns or other kind of surrounding circumstances. So, those with aging congregations have kind of a similar story to tell in many cases. We talked earlier in terms of technology about rural communities, and so there's different ways that being a rural community impacts the life of the church and perhaps the way the community responds to things like COVID. College towns, we had a couple pastors who served college towns, and they talked about how their congregants were concerned about the kids coming back, even though they knew that it was important for the economy and for the kids' education, but had deep concerns about the public safety of that, and how that worked its way into the church. Pastors have seen in a way that they hadn't seen before this divide between social media haves and have-nots, the people that are active on Facebook, Twitter, that have good internet access, those that don't, those people that function from a smartphone, those folks who only have a landline, people that have or don't have a computer, and all those kinds of things, and the challenges that raised when churches were forced to shift modes and mediums for worship in particular, but also just staying in touch with each other. Some pastors found it really hard to just even get in touch with congregants because they weren't seeing them in person. Financial, of course, is having an impact in different ways. Some churches have seemed just wholly unaffected and even have been able to to generate additional income in some cases, and others have really suffered greatly from the economic impacts around us. It was a little disturbing, the number of pastors in the survey. I didn't count them specifically, but there was more than a handful that said they have considered leaving pastoral ministry during this time period because they are just simply exhausted and they just don't know if they can keep it up. And I think I know a couple that actually have left. Pastoral experience is one of ups and downs. And those ups and downs are not uncommon in church life and people's lives, but they've been greatly exaggerated, primarily by the circumstances around the pandemic. Almost to a respondent in one way or another, pastors talk about how boundaries between their personal life and church work have been closed and now overlap in ways that they have not before. Not that pastors are really known for having really great boundaries to begin with sometimes, but under these circumstances, as is the case for many of us who have been, forced to work from home or who have chosen to work from home, sharing space with family, and managing all of that while trying to keep pace with the ministry needs. One pastor said, "No one gets my best self." And I thought that was really an important statement. No one gets my best self. The pastors relate to this time as a liminal period, meaning it's so much is unknown and remains in transition that it's really hard to plan. At times it's hard to anticipate what's next and what's the right thing to do next. And it can be difficult to prepare, especially long term, as many pastors like to do, plan in advance for worship and preaching and the rhythms of the church life. But we don't know when things are going to change again and how they're going to change when they change. So that's difficult. And then this statement that nobody was trained, nobody was taught, nobody learned how to minister through a pandemic, through a climate crisis, or what some called kind of a civil war in our political sphere. So a lot of pastors feel inadequately equipped to really respond. And those that do feel equipped not because they know what to do, but because they have the tools to adapt. So yes, you might say that pastors are a bit stressed. And that's a blurry image to begin with, but it's even more blurry when it gets blown up to that size. So I asked pastors what disheartens them or what kind of breaks their heart, and then I asked them, what gives them joy. And so these are, I'm going to go through the disheartening factors first, and then we'll go back and we'll get a little more positive energy into the room. The first disheartening factor is that pastors are, missing the opportunities to provide pastoral care in a manner that they're accustomed to. Many people go into ministry because they love pastoral care, but they can't do it in the ways that they're used to. Nursing homes, hospitals, personal contacts, informal connections, all that stuff has been, taken away or limited in ways that they're just really feeling the isolation from that, like all of us are. But, it's a part of their identity as a pastor. The added workload is disheartening to many. The learning curve for utilizing technology that has fallen in many cases to the pastor, some who are much better prepared to take that up, and others who really are not prepared at all to take that up. Pastors report picking up extra office work, having to handle things they might have left or might have had volunteer or other support for previously. Having to provide the energy to get things done in the church. And that was a big one that, in some cases, things like committees and teams, at least for a while, stopped functioning. And in order to kind of get those going again and to keep some energy going with the congregation, pastors really felt responsible to provide that energy. And just this whole idea of doing more for worship than usual, because I don't think Enton talked about this, but preparing to lead in a digital environment is a different process than preparing to walk into a sanctuary on Sunday morning and lead. And it's generally a more time consuming and intensive process. When actually before Enton was at Bethany and Bethany started its distance learning programs, they actually realized the challenge of having an online format for education. And they gave their faculty a time and a half teaching load for each class to accommodate that extra work. So it kind of begs the question, what would it mean to give our pastors time and a half for worship preparation under the circumstances where there's this kind of extra requirement around the digital component? Another disheartening factor in transient opinions and positions of people related to things like meeting in person, wearing masks, physical distancing, political positions, what we see culturally, we also see reflected in the church in terms of a lot of those opinions and divisions. Pastors are disheartened by their own increased family demands, and that could include things like supporting children in remote learning and a number of other things. The pastors feel the weight of the emotional toll of the pandemic, and this would not be unique to pastors. I think we all feel this to some extent, but they carry it not just for themselves, but oftentimes bear it for others as well. Pastors are really concerned about people who are getting overlooked and missed with respect to what the church is currently offering. The statistics that Enton shared from Barna would reflect a little bit that concern is a real concern. People are creating distances being created between communities and the folks that make those communities up. Pastors worry about the financial positions of their congregations. Pastors are disheartened by denominational division and sense of decline throughout the denomination. Pastors are disheartened by what they experience as decreasing patience and tolerance by congregational members and participants. They talk about both themselves and people around them becoming testy. And they say that the environment of the church oftentimes feels like a tinderbox to them, that something, just any little spark could set somebody or something off because of the stress that everybody's under. Another comment about members leaving, some purposefully and some angry, or some just kind of falling off the map. Just disheartening to some that the buildings have not been available to the community in the ways that they had been previously. 12-step groups was one specific thing that a pastor said, we used to do this, we miss doing this, having 12-step groups in our facility. I suspect some of that's coming back online now 6 months later, but not all of it. It's still a loss in our communities. This inability to grieve together, how many churches and pastors have put off memorial services or who have had to do a service in a digital live streaming or something. It's not grieving together. It's maybe recognizing the passing and the death, but it's just harder to grieve together. It's disheartening because a lot of the congregants, some pastors say their congregants don't have the tools that they need at their disposal to respond to the kind of the circumstances and crises in the world around them. And of course, it's harder for pastors to help them right now. And finding a source of energy when things that typically give them energy are taken away. And a lot of that for pastors, a lot of that seems to have to do with the interpersonal ability to be in space with people. Well, there's a lot of disheartening factors. I'll keep plowing through them here. It's disheartening to pastors when folks yearn for the good old days. That's what nostalgia is. Is it Diana Butler Bass? I forget, one of those authors who used to say roughly this idea that nostalgia basically is indicating that we've determined that God is no longer in control and has nothing better for us ahead, or has nothing of worth for us ahead. We're just holding on to a point in the past. and that's not a very good theological position to be in, but we hold on to things in a way that's not so effective. And what's it going to mean when we go back after the pandemic? Have we heard this? We're going back to normal. I think most pastors would say they have no expectations of going back to normal. And in fact, they would be fearful of the idea of going back to normal, whatever normal was. God bless him or her. I don't know who it was, but one pastor said that all of these circumstances, they're a new pastor. They just started like a month before the pandemic kicked in. And they said it's just not a great experience being a pastor, which is unfortunate. How long will they stick it out, right? Speaking out on controversial issues, and particularly the topic of racism, has or nearly has cost pastors their job. And this is not a joke, and this is absolutely true. I know at least 2 pastors for whom this is the case, and others, many others who state that they feel constrained in what they're able to say and how they're able to address the issue because they feel that it would put their employment in jeopardy. Pastors struggle with their own health concerns and at times feel that the congregation doesn't understand how that affects them and their ability to minister. Pastors have this idea that they have to remain strong when they have fears, anxiety, and grief of their own. And sometimes the rest of us expect that from our pastor. We look to our pastor to kind of help us not be fearful, not have anxiety, and be able to help process our grief. But how do they get to deal with their own fears, anxiety, and grief? Pastors reported that they often were developing more attitudes of anger, frustration, and disappointment with congregants than they were comfortable with. I'll put it that way. It's kind of I guess it speaks for itself. And it was disheartening to the extent that many pastors felt they had to be the glue that holds people and the ministries together. And there's one more slide of disheartening factors, pressure of decision-making related to COVID and how that keeps changing, the requirements around that, the way that in some congregations, a family or individual exercises power in a not helpful way. Fear that folks won't come back when the pandemic is over. Thank you again, Enton, for just reinforcing that fear, or at least turning that fear into a reality that people are changing their ideas about what their relationship with church will be. And for pastors, this is a hard one to think about. Zoom fatigue, we're 90 minutes in here tonight, and that's usually about as long as I can stay on a Zoom session. So I understand if you start to drop off. Lack of support from church leadership in some cases. For some of our more liturgical traditions, they said they really miss the sacraments and being able to offer the sacraments and participate communally with the sacraments. We're not a sacramental tradition in the Church of the Brethren, but we do have our sacraments or our rituals that are important to us. We have one coming up, Love Feast, and it'd be interesting to know more about how churches are gonna do that this year, and how it will change from what we tried to do last year. And then, of course, perhaps one of the most disheartening factors for pastors is division, disunity, and conflict within the congregation, among leaders of the church, or even within the staff if it was a larger congregation. So as you can see, there's a large menu of kind of things that can really weigh down on our pastors. And I'm not suggesting at all that every pastor feels every or even any of these, but these are all real things that the 110 pastors that I surveyed said to us. I'm going to switch the encouraging factors. I do want to get to some conversation. This is a long list too. So here are the things that encourage pastors and help them feel, give them joy, help them have a better sense of having a positive ministry. It's encouraging to them when they can learn and implement technological things that connect congregants and help to expand the reach of the congregation. Those stories about new people coming into contact, or people that have moved away. This has happened at Highland Avenue. People that have moved away have stayed connected to the church in ways they wouldn't have been able to had we not been forced into this technological shift. There's a different attention to one-to-one relationships. For instance, I know some pastors that have increased their telephoning of congregants and taking time just to have a conversation with them. And they weren't able to do that, or didn't do that so much before. New ways of including people. I put musicians here because that's part of our own experience again at Highland Avenue, is that we've been able to incorporate some of the gifts of musicians in ways that it's harder to do when you're live. You know, you can't sing all four parts of a hymn by yourself if you're in live worship, but if you're recording something for a streamed worship service or even a Zoom worship service, you can. And we've seen some real great creativity from folks around that kind of stuff. And in addition to discovering lots of new talents, the pastors in this survey talked about, for instance, one pastor talked about an individual that they never really led a Bible study before, but really got into leading Bible studies on Zoom and has been doing a fantastic job. And people really love it. Or video editing, people who maybe hadn't done it before, or who did have that skill but had never been called on in the church. Well, this is the world made for them, right? This whole video world. So and encourage an increased appreciation for those moments when they do get to be in person, and a sense that when things are more open and congregations are able to rejoin more, much more freely, that we'll appreciate it more. We'll enjoy each other more. We'll be less in a hurry, maybe, at least for the first couple of weeks. Exploring new forms of worship. Pastors reported that, you know, we've wanted to try these things for a long time, but we just couldn't get people to give us the permission or the space to do it. Now we have to do it. And it's been a good thing. It's been energizing for many pastors to explore new forms of worship. Pastors report a new awareness of community realities, like the financial vulnerabilities in the local community and maybe in their congregation, and injustices around them, and an opportunity to work with their congregations to explore and understand and respond to those realities. Again, so many of these are kind of the flip side of what you saw in the disheartening factors. It's when they can be a catalyst for things that bring energy rather than a catalyst for things that bring distress. An opportunity to clarify and bring to light what is really important to us. How many of your churches have asked that question? How many times as a pastor have you asked that question in the last year? Okay, what is really important to us here? What do we need to make sure we're doing and not missing? It's a great time to ask that question, and many pastors are finding it to be so. There's a new opportunity to discuss the spiritual dimensions of the things that are happening in the world around us, and the things that are happening through the world to us. It's a great opportunity to discover and kind of celebrate our resilience, and to cultivate our creativity, and to discover adaptability. And pastors are experiencing this both in their own ministries and in their congregations. And they really appreciate it, where congregations are willing to adapt and willing to allow their pastors to be creative. Pastors recognize that and appreciate it. It's forced some congregations to try new things to reach out to the community, and that encourages pastors. They love to participate in that and see it happening. Getting some needed maintenance done on church buildings. One church reported they had a major asbestos abatement project that they just couldn't figure out how to get done when they were in session, and when they had to close their facility for a time, they were able to get that work done. And I imagine that's happened in some other places too. Pastors love to journey with the congregation as it rises to the challenges. They love, again, to be empowered to exercise their own creativity and their decision making irrespective of expectations. And some pastors say at this point in the scheme of things, they've stopped worrying as much about what others think about how they exercise their creativity and the decisions that they need to make, and it's kind of freed them. Again, that's not everybody, but for some, that's been true. Continuing to share the gospel message and the love of Jesus, scripture that still speaks with power. When that's a focus, pastors report that's encouraging. It's encouraging when pastors receive care from us as their congregation, when small online groups provide an opportunity for a new kind of intimacy and inclusion that maybe isn't always able when they are in their when things require a physical presence together. Good things about worship: finding new ways to express and articulate themselves. Some pastors said that they've had to discipline themselves better around preparation. And they know they're talking to a screen, or when they got to walk in and do a recording or do a live stream, they're not as likely to maybe come in and kind of let their personality lead in their ministry, right? You know, some pastors are just really good at coming in and just kind of winging it and kind of letting their personality lead and kind of their back, but some preparation for some of those pastors has become really important, and they've appreciated the opportunity to learn that discipline. The opportunity to provide pre-recorded translation for a specific church said this, that, you know, they have multiple language groups represented in their congregation, and they have struggled with how to translate. Well, now they can do it because they're pre-recording stuff. And so they can do the translations ahead of time, and they're right there, and everybody can worship in real time with the translation on the recording, real time on the recording. Involvement in the community. Not all churches have become isolated. Some have actually reached out into their communities, and this is associated with that, but serving material needs within the community. A church that started a whole new free meal program because they recognized that they needed to serve that need within their community. Pastors are encouraged when the circumstances help them to clarify priorities within the congregation, to reimagine what it means to be church. When they see an increased focus on making disciples, and generally that statement was accompanied in the survey with kind of a counter statement, which was, instead of spending so much time on worrying about XYZ related to keeping the church running or whatever, but making disciples is a priority. A willingness to learn, hearing positive feedback and encouragement from congregants. Pastors are people too, right? They love, they need to be affirmed and appreciated. And mutual ministry, they love to see folks helping each other out and putting others' needs in front of their own, and not always, you know, relying on the pastor for that. And more time with family has been a benefit to some. Have felt like that's been a real encouraging thing during this time. So pastors want you to know a few things. They want you to know how tired they are. They want you to know how outside their comfort zone many of them are. They want you to know, in many cases, how underappreciated they feel. They want you to know how much they feel that they have to absorb the negativity and anger and grief of others, and how exhausting that can be for them. They want you to know how disheartening it is when church decisions become divisive. And they also want you to know how important it is for you to participate and share your gifts of ministry. They want you to know that they too are anxious over the future of your congregation, and many of them were anxious before the last year just because of kind of trends in church life, but they're even more anxious now. They want you to know how challenging it is to build the bridge while walking on it, which is how most of them describe this time period. And one, I like this other way of saying it: we're building this plane in midair, is how one pastor put it. And I really got that sense from a strong majority of the pastors. For some, building that plane in midair is exhilarating. They love it. For some, it's deadly, right? It just eats them up. So, the reality is building a plane in midair, how equipped and how supported we are in that process means different things. And they want you to know that they miss you too. And they miss being with you in tangible and concrete ways. So this is the last 15 minutes is talking time. Few questions I had here that we could explore together. These don't have to be the questions we explore, but what have you heard from just this quick summary of? I'm going to stop sharing right now. What have you heard from these pastors that stood out to you? Maybe things that surprised you, or something that you can say, oh yeah, I heard that from my pastor, or something where you just kind of go, I don't know, that didn't sound quite right. What did you mean by that, John? I think you're just making that up, Jonathan. Or really anything. Go take yourself off mute and jump in. Not many of us here.
Well, Jonathan, I put in the chat session that, that was sad, that list of so many things that are disheartening, but yet I can see it. I mean, I couldn't go, oh no, that can't be on your list. I could certainly see that, because I think we have put our pastors in a very hard position normally, and you throw the pandemic in and all of that brings emotionally from each individual of the congregation. Now compounding that onto a pastor is tough.
Yeah, thanks, Leonard. Any of you pastors on here have anything to say?
Lots of smiles from them.
So I think, and just break in. I can talk indefinitely. So just break in if you want to add something. I think, that part of the question here is okay, if some of this, if most of this is, we can actually accept this as being, the shared experiences of our pastors, what are we doing, and how do we need to go about ensuring that our pastors stick around, that our pastors are healthy, that our pastors are really tapping into their strengths and their best gifts, and kind of, what are some of the keys, what are some of the ideas that we have? Certainly I've got a laundry list of them, but what are some of the keys and ideas that you all have for how to be active kind of community partners with our pastors in times like these? I'll just say one other thing, and that is that I did come into this survey with a bias, and that is that I have a lot of trouble in our system with the repeated mantra to pastors that they just need to take care of themselves. I understand it's said in with good intention, but rarely do I think is the answer to the kinds of stresses and demands of pastoral life as simple as pastor, take care of yourself, because generally speaking, the system does little or nothing to support that pastor in that activity of taking care of themselves. And so, for instance, one of the things that I try to advocate for all the time in our current congregation is I'm on the worship life team. And every time our pastor is preparing to go on vacation, or in this case, Pastor Katie's going to be able to take a sabbatical this summer, I keep saying to the worship life team, you cannot ask the pastor to prepare the services for the time when she's going to be gone. That totally defeats the purpose of her taking vacation time. I said, and so it's our responsibility as a worship life team to have a strategy in place and to have the leadership in place to be able to give her her self-care time in a way that it actually is beneficial to her, right? And it's little things like that that we kind of do without even really thinking about them sometimes, that I think are what I mean by kind of systemically we don't support that encouragement to do self-care. All right, please, somebody else talk. I'm just tired of my own voice.
Well, Jonathan, one of the things that I wanted to say is that we can do to help our pastors is encourage all of our board chairs and leadership team chairs to plug into the district's YouTube account and get this video and watch it, and then share it with their leadership teams
Yeah.
and their board chairs or their boards, because we need to get it to far more than the 28 people that we've had on this Zoom session. It's been excellent, and I think we as congregants all need to hear this.
Thanks, Leonard. Janice, I saw you trying to jump in there, I think.
Yeah, basically, I think Leonard sort of hit it there. Because my question as a congregant or layperson in our church is, what can we, and there's pastors here that might be able to help answer this, but what can the general population of our church do specifically to help our pastor and to help them, our pastor is a sheep, so help her thrive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd love to hear. Kathy, you want to respond? I can't see everybody on my screen, so if I'm missing somebody. But I see
Well,
Kathy.
I wanted to offer something that I did last year when I was board chair, which was I still found ways to meet with my pastor. But I also was hearing people in the congregation saying, oh, our pastor has less to do now. And I knew from my conversations with my pastor that she was actually doing quite a bit more and working even harder and feeling half as productive. And so I just used a board session to kind of ask some probing questions and let her speak to that, and then followed up with an article in the newsletter so the wider congregation could kind of hear both sides of that conversation, because I think it's important to kind of correct misinformation and nip those things in the bud. And so it was kind of an opportunity for our pastor to say, this is what it's like for me now, and then for the board to have a different perspective than what we were hearing from some members in the church, because pastors were not actually doing less in our case, but working even harder to to learn Zoom and do all that stuff. So that's one specific thing that I thought was helpful last year.
Oh, that's so great. I mean, to advocate for your pastor and to listen to your pastor by asking, good questions and then allowing him or her to respond, I think is what a good job. Congrats. I mean, really, I mean, that's exemplary, I think. Other thoughts?
As I think about this, I think of comparisons to other professions, just through personal experience and hearing other people talk. And I think something important for them could also be very important for our pastors. Did you take your Sabbath day? Like actually take it, not kind of take it.
Yeah.
Not except for that hour, or did you take your Sabbath day? Did you take two? When was the last time you did that? Go ahead and ask those questions. I think maybe sometimes we don't ask those questions because we feel like that's a personal question and we don't want to cross some sort of line there, but I think that maybe we could.
Yeah, and what's the responsibility of the congregation then in that instance? I mean, it's one thing to ask the question and encourage it. It's another thing to say, okay, why not? And what can we do to ensure that you can have a Sabbath day? We can ensure that folks understand that's not the day to call you. And, to ensure that, we're going to designate somebody else in the congregation that's available on that day, and they'll get to make the decision about whether the pastor needs to be notified about whatever the crisis is that comes up, right? I mean, and it's put into a different position. Or, the number of pastors that get to the end of the year and haven't used their vacation is disturbing. And that should never happen. It should never happen. As a board, as an executive team or personnel committee, you got to insist that that happen and create the space for it. So thanks, Kirsty. Yeah, no, that's like, that's what I mean about, like, it's not just pastor figure it out. It's let's figure it out together how this is going to work.
Well, and Jonathan, as I think more about it, I'm thinking about a specific conversation I had recently. Our pastors do more than just what they do for our church. They do things district wide. They do things with seminary. They do things nationally. They do things on town committees, community issues. And so when you're talking about have you had that day of rest, we're talking about all of that.
Yeah.
Not just, as it relates to the church specifically.
Exactly. If anybody wants to, and we don't have time tonight, I'm sorry, but if anybody wants a side conversation on how a board or a church can help a pastor, how to write a job description that actually reflects the kinds of time and investment that pastors put into the job, and how the congregation is complementary to that, I'd be glad to share some information on that. I don't see it used very often. When I was a pastor, this is how it worked. I'll just do it quickly. At the beginning of each year, or before the new year came, we would sit down and review my job description as pastor. And that's usually what a church will do. What are we going to pile on the pastor this year, right? If they do anything like that. But that wasn't our question. That's not where we started. Start with the question, what does the church need done this year? What does the church need done this year? Given our priorities, given our activities, given our vision, given our strategy, whatever it is that we're working with for the year ahead, what does the church need done? Start there, get that all lined out, and then ask this question, and how is our pastor, when are we going to turn to our pastor for leadership? At what times, for what things the church needs to get done? And what you're going to discover is the pastor can't cover them all, right? Because the pastor has a limited amount of time. And so the next part of the conversation then is, then how are these other things going to get done? And see, if you forget the how are these other things going to get done part of it, it'll fall back to the pastor, and you haven't helped your pastor at all. But if you can say, one Sunday a month for, and sometimes 2 Sundays a month, so like my deal was I'll preach 36 times a year. So what happens the other 16 Sundays? That wasn't for me to figure out. That was for the church to figure out. And we did it together, but we started there. We need 52 Sundays of sermons. Pastor's going to provide 36 to 40 of those. How are we going to address the others? We're going to refer them back to our worship team, or we're, whatever, however you want to solve that problem. The other thing so that's one thing I would say, just in principle, is don't start with what's the pastor doing, start with what's the church doing, and then figure out what the pastor's role is in that and what others' roles are in that. And then the second thing is absolutely factor in the whole range of how pastors function on your behalf and with you as a congregation. So, make sure you have in a job outline, a job description, things like professional growth. That counts as time. Make sure you have things in there like ecumenical partnering. Make sure you have things in there like denominational and district service. If you want your pastors to be doing that stuff, that's part of their work. That's not, if they want to volunteer for something else outside of what you all have agreed on, sure, many pastors will do that. But in terms of kind of what's considered their work, it's so much better to be really intentional about what your expectations are with each other, about how those things are going to happen. It's much more productive, I think.
Jonathan, we've got 2 people, Dana and Connie, that are waiting, and then we'll go just for a few minutes longer, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, you're the moderator. I'll follow you. Go ahead. So who's up?
Dana, I think I saw you come on first.
Okay. 2 things that I thought about. And one of the things that I think is important is if you're going to ask us a question like, did you take your Sabbath? If you just ask us that question, that feels like a burden. We feel like we're being scolded, and we feel like we're being scolded yet still expecting to get done what we did on the day we didn't take our Sabbath. It's much more helpful if you understand what's going on and say, how can I help you do that? Or how can I accommodate that, rather than just making it another accountability thing.
Yep.
Which an awful lot of the time we're kind of living under this weight of accountability all the time. It's not always placed on us. Sometimes we carry it ourselves, but the thing is that's there. The other thing I would say is, and I love the fact that people are wanting to go do something about this, but I think and this is my own perspective. One, don't take everything that was in that every pastor's going through every one of those things. Those were all things as a compilation. But if you go back and are wanting to help pastors, trying to develop a system and then saying, this is how we're going to help you is not going to be a help. Listening is going to be the first help. So rather than immediately saying, okay, we're going to take this on as a project and do that, will again make it feel like something that's imposed upon us rather than people are listening. And I've been very blessed that people have given me room, in the congregation to share some of these things at leadership team meetings and do some of those things. And it's been helpful just to know that you're heard, and that people know that you're carrying things that you don't always know how to do. And so you may come to your pastor and say, how can we help you do this? And they may say, I don't know. We're navigating a new thing and we don't know. But if you're willing to walk through this with me, that's the best help, that it could be. So again, that's from my heart, not necessarily somebody else's, but.
Oh, I think that's always good counsel, Dana. And I think the more that you as we as churches can ensure a safe space to have those conversations. A lot of pastors would say they don't feel at liberty to be that honest.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, but many do. And many have relationships like you do, Dana, and I hope like our pastor does, and like I did when I was a pastor. I had that kind of relationship, but many don't. So, but certainly we could always, to build a partnership, you start by listening. So I think that's very wise counsel. All right, who else was going here?
Connie.
Thanks for being a pastor and speaking, Dana. Appreciate it.
Yeah, so I'm putting on my pastor hat now instead of as your interim district executive, and that is just to affirm how much more time it takes to do worship experiences online. And, I'm in the pastoral team that I'm part of. I preach about once a month. And last week was my week to preach. And it just struck me, almost hitting me in the face again, how much time this takes, depending on if you have other people helping to prepare the technology stuff, the PowerPoint slides that you're using in Zoom or whatever it is. Because if you don't have that, then it ends up you do a lot of that yourself. So it takes at least twice as much time for me to prepare for worship as it usually would. And then I put on my church musician hat for a moment and say, okay, so I'm playing for worship in my congregation, playing piano about once or twice a month. And again, I'm not only practicing to prepare, I'm also recording that then and messing around with that. So I shouldn't say messing around because it's a positive experience to have it recorded on Zoom. It just is so much better. But, it's just an extra step. It's not just showing up and doing it. So, yeah, I just affirm that. And thank you, Jonathan, for your work on this. And, I'd be glad to have conversations with people too, with my interim DE hat on as well.
Well,
Great.
Jonathan, as you can tell, we've ran over. It was a topic that we needed to hear, and your insight and your collection of data and sharing it in a way. Thank you so much, and thank you for making it available so that people can see it.
Yeah. And feel free to reach out to me if I can, support you in any way in your congregation. Like as Connie, has said, certainly willing to both have the information shared, but also to have conversations about it. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. Would like to encourage everyone to come back tomorrow night and bring a friend or two with you to the potluck. Tomorrow night is our two more great sessions. 6:30 is sex trafficking with Vivek, and 7:30, a little lighter, train to age with Joni Grant. So a little bit of variety for your palate tomorrow. Thank you all for being here tonight, and blessings.
Hi, Purvi. I'm so glad to see you today. I've been thinking about you lately because I've heard about an upcoming event that I want to tell you about. I've noticed that you have gifts for working with people. I wonder what God might be inviting you to do with your life.
You mean becoming pastor?
Could be, but not just pastoral ministry. There are many types of ministries.
Like what?
There are a variety of chaplaincy ministries, many administrative ministries, mission work, and a lot more.
Well, when is this event?
Here, I have the information for you. It's Calling the Called, and it's happening in the fall of 2021. There'll be an emphasis on discernment, discipleship, and direction. It will be a time for exploring, reflecting, and discerning your call, hearing others' stories, and discovering pathways to ministry. I hope that you'll join us.
Definitely. Thank you, Linda.
Is your congregation yearning for renewal and growth? Do you hunger and thirst for fresh ideas to breathe life anew both inside and outside of the church walls? If you knew of a ministry team of the district that could offer help and resources, would you be interested? The Church Revitalization and Development Team exists to aid congregations in the areas of self-assessment, renewal, and growth. We are working to offer resources to congregations such as church board consultations, coaching avenues for pastors, workshops and training opportunities on church growth, and information regarding revitalization grants and fundraising. The Church of the Brethren is a remarkable church, focusing and acting in community and togetherness. But what does that look like in today's world, where community and togetherness appear much different than they did in the past? The Church Revitalization and Development Team desires to walk with you in discovering God's will for your congregation's path into the future. Please contact the district office for more information.
Ryan, you're a wizard.